Why have witches become so ubiquitous in American culture? Happy Halloween week, all of you. I thought for this week's Wednesday video, where I typically try to connect the past to the present, I would talk a little bit about witches, something that have become such a symbolic fixture in our cultural imagination, not just at Halloween now, but also year-round. It seems you see witches wherever you look. TV shows and movies feature witches as good guys. Politicians decry witch hunts. Witches have become a cultural symbol of resistance and anti-establishment. Witchcraft as a practice is a resurgent form of feminist and environmentalist identity. But why do witches remain such a potent image? And how has that image changed over the past few centuries? These are the questions I'm going to hope to address, albeit very briefly, in this video, as I provide a general survey and overview of the American fascination with witches as a concept and as an identity. In short, to spoil my main takeaway, witches often serve as a touchstone for broader cultural anxieties in the nation, which is why they crop up every few generations as such a ubiquitous symbol. Let's dig in. Witches, the devil, and demons have long been a cultural expression, and by that, I and many of the scholars who focus on witches in cultural imagination, by that cultural expression, we mean not only are they typically presented and have a ubiquitous presence, but also that they are the vehicle through which many societies express cultural ideas. One example that I often use with students and when I give lectures on this topic is I invite someone up to the whiteboard or the chalkboard. Heaven forbid we have to hear the chalk on a chalkboard. But with the whiteboard, I ask them, draw what comes to your mind when you think of the devil or Satan. What's the cultural meaning? And you'll typically have someone who draws horns and a tail and a pitchfork. And then I tell them that all of those images are the creation of, or the accumulation of various elements developed over generations that actually aren't found in the Bible or early Christian expressions. In other words, we place our ideas onto these images that go well beyond what scriptural and orthodox religion originally taught, which means that they carry baggage with them that we can now dissect that tell us a lot about the broader society. Now, there is a long history of demonic possession, especially in Catholicism, which in many ways is the precursor to these ideas of witches and witchcraft and the necessity of policing the boundaries through this witches' possession. I don't want to go into all of that in this video. Just know that it's at the heart of a lot of these disputes over priesthood control, human beings embodying these demonic impulses, whether humans can act as agents of evil versus agents of good, and what role does a church of an institution versus a body of faith play in these debates. There's also many trials of witches and executions in Europe in the 15th and 1600s, with tens of thousands likely killed as part of it. And what's remarkable is the lack of that going on in the British colonies. We tend to think of witches in America as this ubiquitous presence. I know I've used that word a few times already in this video, but this ubiquitous presence in colonial New England, especially among the Puritans. But that in itself is a cultural creation that I'll get to in a bit. Because what's remarkable is how few witch trials there were in Puritan New England. And when there were cases of people who were dealing with possession or accused of witchcraft, it did not play out in the sexy Hollywood script. There's a number of scholars who have dug into these episodes and show that often when those are considered being possessed or practicing witchcraft is a case of a woman self-confessing to their minister because they take their minister's words seriously when they're told that they're sinful creatures and could at any time start acting as instruments of the devil and practicing these witchcraft ideas. And therefore they go and they pray and they read the scriptures and then they're saved. And that does not make it into our popular depictions. And when women were were accused of witchcraft, it was often those women who are found on the margins of society. They're poor, they're widowed, or independent. And when there are witch hunts, there are moments of deep cultural insecurity or crises on the boundaries of those faiths. And so witchcraft, or witch hunts in other words, are often a form of boundary maintenance that, gets into ideas of power and control rather than theological possession. Everyone often thinks about Salem, of course, Salem, Massachusetts. But Salem was very unique. In many ways, it was atypical of the colonial Puritan experience. First of all, it took place decades after the other witch trials or witch hunts that took place in colonial New England. There were a lot more people accused. There were a lot more people killed. They used things like spectral evidence. There were disputes over imperial authority. There was not civic control on the ground. And when things passed after 1692, many almost immediately regretted their actions because it cast this idea on the Puritans that was not really a reality for many, many decades. In other words, it gave a distorted view of colonial Puritanism. But from this background, this historical record of witches and witchcraft and demonology and possession, we get the material with which cultural identities or cultural expressions will later be formed. By the way, if you enjoy this kind of analysis, this unapologetic geekery and nerding out over the past and how it can help inform our present, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. You can like and share the video so we can broaden the discussion. If you want to give back, you can consider becoming a member, which gives you a few perks like early access to the videos. Also, next week on Wednesday, November 5th at 7 p.m. Mountain Time, I will be doing a live Q&A on this channel. So please mark your calendar and please join me. And bring as many questions as you want, hard or easy. I will try to tackle as many as I can. And it should be a lot of fun. All right, let's get back to witches in American cultural memory. I could point to a number of prominent moments in which this idea of witches, especially in Puritan New England, come to the forefront of American culture and society, but I'll just highlight two. One in the 19th century and one in the 20th century that demonstrate how this idea of witches evolves and reflect modern day concerns. The first is the mid-1800s with the Transcendentalist movement and the American Reformers, sometimes known as the American Romantics, who start wrestling with their New England legacies, but in a particular cultural context. Most prominent among these is Nathaniel Hawthorne, who wrote, among other things, the Scarlet Letter, which depicts these Puritans in a very particular way. Most especially when talking about these things like witchcraft in the colonial New England era. They are trying to cast the Puritans as irrational, illogical, for the purpose of trying to emphasize the rationality and enlightened status of 19th century New Englanders. In other words, this resurrection of the witchcraft tales in 19th century America was meant to prop up this new enlightened version of Christianity, placing distance between them and their spiritual ancestors. This was at the heart of disputes going on at the time over what is rational religion, and those witch hunts symbolize the dangers of religious extremism. Now, witches themselves were no longer seen as a continuing threat, but the zealotry seen both by the women and by those in charge were meant to symbolize what happens when you untether religious practice from zealous belief. And that's why we need a more rational, enlightened religion. So that ends up framing how many come to understand America's past of witchcraft. Now, flash forward another century, and I could talk about a number of episodes in between these, but in the 1950s, the next major moment that reframes the witch trials is the McCarthy era and the fights over Cold War identity and who is a communist and who's not. You might remember Joseph McCarthy, the senator from Wisconsin, claiming that there was this insidious cabal inside the American government, the deep state to use modern day terms, who were secretly supporting the communist agenda and that they had to be rooted out. And he and the House Un-American Activities Committee would call in individuals and say, were you ever a communist? communist? Do you subscribe to their agenda? And there would be what looked like a witch hunt, to use our modern day sentiment of these in authority, seeking out otherwise innocent individuals and trying to do character assassination and false accusations. Among that time, Arthur Miller, the playwright, writes The Crucible, which recasts the story of the Salem witch hunts as a story of innocent women being hunted down by these overly zealous men, people in authority. What's notable now is implied within that story is our sympathizing with the witches, that the women were wronged, and the people in charge were those who were becoming too overzealous in their attempt to exercise power and control. And was notably unlike the Nathaniel Hawthorne era, in which the zealotry was based in real belief, right? They truly believed what they were doing. They were just zealots. Now, those leaders are cast as hypocritical, as not really believing what they're doing. Instead, they are just making up excuses to go after innocent people. That narrative, in large part, still frames how many view the witchcraft trials in American culture. In fact, if you go to Salem today, that's often the framework depicted. We are still understanding the Salem witch trials in a Cold War McCarthyistic narrative, which I think is quite fascinating. So that's the dominant message. But we've even seen some other forms of cultural memory and expression that go beyond how we memorialize Salem in recent years. So let's talk about 3 arenas in which the image of witches have taken an especially powerful place in modern American society: in religion, in popular culture, and in politics. In religion, we've seen the rise in recent years of Wicca, of taking on the identity of witches in a religious, spiritual, I know those terms don't directly relate, way. Wicca began as a movement in 1940s Britain. It was part of a pagan movement to return to nature outside of Christianity and capitalism. It arrives in America in the 1960s. It celebrates a goddess as well as a god. There's no formal structure, no formal belief. They are practitioners, not believers. And the motto is harm none and do as you will. What's I think significant about this movement is it uses this image and practice of witchcraft, though of course in a much more secular way, that embraces feminism and environmentalism. Their practice of magic connects to counter medicine acts, especially institutionalized and pharmaceutical medicine acts like essential oils. It's a countercultural movement away from Christianity and reflective of today's spiritual but not religious crowd. And it's estimated now to have 1.5 million people who identify as witches in America, 800,000 of which come from this Wiccan tradition. But they're, again, repurposing and reclaiming this identity of witches in a new way. And then we have in popular culture, where, like with the Agatha figure in the recent Marvel and Disney television series, witches are now seen as mostly harmless and perhaps a source for good, but at the root, witches are seen as misunderstood. They're anti-institutional. They're also feminist. So think of Agatha series on Disney as the most recent example of someone who, yes, might do some dangerous things, but is doing so from a position of anxiety, sensitivity, insecurity, and especially a position of being misunderstood, crafting this anti-institutional hero, which makes these witches the type of anti-hero we see in other elements of popular culture, which is why they seem so potent in that sphere. And then we have in the political realm invoking the term witch hunt. Nobody does that more, of course, than Donald Trump, who tweeted the words witch hunt more than 300 times in his first presidential term. Which reflects now this broader understanding, this through line that we've been discussing now, of the modern narrative of the term witch, and especially witch hunt. It's stripped of religion, it's focused on fanaticism, it assumes the innocence of the accused, and directly attacks the accusers. In other words, it's weaponizing that type of Cold War narrative of witches that dates back to, say, Arthur Miller and The Crucible. So modern witches now are found in popular culture, politics, and even religion, often as an anti-institutional message that emphasizes a position of misunderstanding and is even invoked in today's culture wars. So to conclude, one of the reasons why I believe witches are so potent as a cultural expression today is because they're an identity that many can sympathize with as counter-institutional, counter-cultural, and counter-authority, as well as misunderstood. We accuse irrational people not as being witches, but as being witch hunters. And all of this, I would argue, is largely due to us living in a much more secularized society in which witches no longer pose the threat they once might have, either in the accusations of actual witch hunts in the 1600s or as an example of religious fanaticism in the 1800s. Now witches are an example of someone misunderstood, accused, who is standing up against the man, quite literally often now that it's embraced as part of a feminist identity. I hope this video made sense. If you think I missed anything, let me know in the comments. What do you think are some of the most potent and powerful expressions of witches in modern society? Let me know in the comments. Like the video, that really helps. Share the video if you found it useful. Subscribe to the channel if you want more nerdy religion and historical content. And if you want to give back, consider becoming a member. History has never been more relevant than it is today because it allows us to make sense of these identities and structures and practices that we might otherwise take for granted, and allows us to unpack what does it mean why we might see something as witches and witchcraft and mean something here where it might have been something fundamentally different in the past.